I used to think death arrived loudly. Sirens, screams, a moment you could point to and say, there, everything changed. I was wrong. Death is quiet. It slips into the room when no one is watching. It waits for you to look away. My best friend is gone. And the strange thing is, nothing dramatic happened that day. No warning bell. No final speech. No moment where the world slowed down enough for me to understand what I was about to lose. Just an ordinary day, like the thousands before it. Like the ones I thought we still had ahead. We met when time felt endless, when the future was a wide open road, and consequences felt theoretical, something that happened to other people, in other stories. We made plans we never wrote down because we assumed there would always be a later. Later, we to talk about the hard things. Later, we stood fix what was quietly breaking. Later, we steeze what mattered. Later never showed up. I keep replaying the last conversation. Not because it was meaningful, but because it wasn't. We talked about nothing. About errands. About noise. About things that didn't matter. As if meaning could be postponed without cost. As if life kept receipts. There's a moment after someone dies that no one prepares you for. It's not the grief. It's the disbelief. Your mind refuses to update reality. You reach for your phone without thinking. You imagine their reaction to something funny. You plan to tell them something later. Then remember there is no later anymore. That he sees when it hits. Not like a wave. Like a vacuum. What haunts me isn't instead just that my friend died. It's that I didn't see it coming. Because I didn't want to. We treat the people closest to us like they're permanent fixtures, like walls, like gravity. We assume they'll always be there because imagining otherwise feels rude, superstitious, dramatic. So we don't look too closely. We don't ask the second question. We don't to notice the long pauses. We don't hear what isn't said being said. There were signs. I see them now. Lined up like footprints in snow. But at the time, they were easy to ignore. Easier to explain away. Easier to label as just a phase, or just stress, or just life. That's the dangerous part. Nothing looks like a disaster when it's still survivable. I believed friendship was indestructible. That history was armor. That love alone could outrun time, illness, silence, and decay. I believed we were safe. We always believe that right before we unsit. Since my friend died, I've learned something unsettling. Regret doesn't come from what you did wrong. It comes from what you didn't realize mattered until it was gone. The conversations you postponed. The questions you didn't ask. The discomfort you avoided. Because comfort felt harmless. I tell myself, I didn't say no. But deep down, that sit's not entirely true. I knew something was off. I just didn't think it was urgent. And that assumption, that deadly, invisible assumption, is the real reason this story exists. Because death didn't teach me something profound in a single moment. It taught me slowly, cruelly, by removing the one person who could have proven me wrong. And by the time I understood the lesson, it was already too late. What I didn't see, what I refused to see, is where this really begins. We build our lives around assumptions we never question. Assumptions that feel so stable, so ordinary, that challenging them seems unnecessary, almost insulting. Like asking whether the ground beneath your feet plans to disappear tomorrow. My best friend was one of those assumptions. They were always there, always responding, always surviving whatever came next. So when life looked normal on the surface, I accepted it as proof that everything was normal underneath. That's how safety works. It doesn't announce itself. It lulls you. Psychologists have a word for this. Normalcy bias. The tendency to believe that because nothing terrible has happened yet, nothing terrible is happening now. It's why people stay in buildings during fires, why warnings are ignored, why danger feels exaggerated, right up until it isn't. We mistake familiarity for permanence. I mistook routine for resilience. We still laughed. We still joked the same way. Still talked about plans. Vague ones, unanchored ones, the kind you make when you assume time is generous. There was no obvious emergency, no collapse, no reason, I told myself, to overreact. History is full of this exact mistake. Civilizations didn't fall because everyone was panicking. They fell because people were comfortable, because the markets were open, because the streets were busy, because yesterday looked like today, and today looked survivable. Rome didn't wake up one morning and vanish. It decayed politely, quietly. Over time, so did we. When my friends started canceling plans, I told myself they were tired. When their messages got shorter, I assumed they were busy. When their laughter felt thinner, I blamed adulthood. That's what overconfidence looks like. Not arrogance, but trust without inspection. We tell ourselves, if it was serious, I'd know. If it were dangerous, it would be obvious. If it mattered, it would announce itself. But the truth is crueler. The most dangerous moments rarely feel dangerous at all. There's comfort in denial. It protects your schedule, your emotional energy, your sense of control. Acknowledging that something is wrong means responsibility follows, and responsibility is heavy. So we choose the lighter story. They're fine. This will pass. I shall check in later. I remember thinking, we'd been through worse. As if past survival guarantees future safety. As if life keeps score. That belief, that history makes us immune, is how people miss the turning point. Because the turning point doesn't feel dramatic. It feels inconvenient, awkward, like a conversation you don't want to have on a perfectly normal day. I didn't want to be dramatic. Didn't want to pry. Didn't want to imagine a version of reality where my best friend wasn't okay. So I didn't act. And in doing so, I unknowingly made a choice. Every ignored feeling, every postponed question, every moment I chose comfort over clarity. They added up, not loudly, not all at once. Just enough to create distance, just enough to delay intervention, just enough to make silence feel acceptable. There's a lie we tell ourselves about love, that it's intuitive, that if something truly matters, we'll feel when it's in danger. But love is not a warning system. It's a blindfold when you're afraid of what you might see. The illusion of safety isn't built in a single moment. It's constructed brick by brick, with routine, with trust, with the quiet promise that tomorrow will resemble today. Until tomorrow doesn't stat. The first real warning didn't have to arrive as an alarm. It arrived as something small, something easy to dismiss, something I noticed and then explained away. And once I did that, there was no undoing what came next. The first crack never looks like a fracture. It looks like fatigue, like mood, like life doing what life always does, complicating things without explanation. That's why it works. I remember the moment I noticed something was off. Not wrong, not alarming, just misaligned. Like a picture hanging slightly crooked on the wall. You see it, you register it, then you decide it's not worth fixing right now. That was the feeling. A pause before they answered. A hesitation where confidence used to live. An absence I couldn't quite name. They were still showing up technically, still replying, still present enough to avoid suspicion. But something essential had shifted. Their eyes didn't linger the same way. Their humor arrived a second too late. Their energy felt borrowed. I noticed. And then I did what people always do when noticing. Requires courage. I rationalize. Everyone gets tired. Everyone changes. Everyone carries things they don't talk about. These sentences sound wise, mature, reasonable. They are also how danger disguises itself as normalcy. When I asked how they were doing, the answer came fast, too fast. Fine, just busy. Same old, no detail, No invitation, just enough to close the door politely. And I let it close. There's a subtle violence in accepting surface-level answers from people you love. Not because they owe you their pain, but because sometimes they're waiting to see if you'll ask again. I didn't stat. I took the exit ramp, changed the subject, let the moment pass. The cracks widened quietly. They stopped talking about the future the way they used to. Plans became hypothetical. Dreams were mentioned with a shrug, not excitement, as if imagining too far ahead felt irresponsible. I told myself it was maturity. That's just the trick. We confuse warning signs with growth. We label withdrawal as independence. We call emotional distance being strong, because the alternative, that something is unraveling, is terrifying. Looking back, the pattern is obvious. Less eye contact, more distractions. A constant low-level exhaustion that sleep never seemed to fix. But patterns are invisible when you're standing inside them. There was one moment, one small, fragile moment, where I almost broke through. They laughed at something I said, then stopped suddenly, like the sound had surprised them, like it didn't belong. For half a second, their face went still, empty. I felt it then, a tightening in my chest, a quiet internal voice whispering, "This matters." I could have asked the harder question. I could have stayed silent long enough for them to fill it. I could have said, "No, really. Tell me." Instead, I made a joke. Humor is a beautiful deflection. It smooths over discomfort, restores balance, keeps the machine running. And machines don't just ask for help. After that, the unease followed me, not loudly, just enough to surface in quiet moments. At night, in the gaps between thoughts, I ignored it, because acknowledging it meant admitting that something fragile was breaking, and that I might be responsible for catching it. The first cracks don't just demand action. They ask for attention, and attention requires presence. Presence requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires risking what you don't want to hear. I told myself there would be time, a better moment, a clearer sign. There's always a better moment, until there isn't. By the time the cracks were visible enough to name, they were already spreading beneath the surface, and I was still standing there, convincing myself that noticing was the same as acting. It wasn't stunt, because the moment I chose comfort over confrontation, the slow collapse had already begun. There's a point where ignoring the cracks becomes impossible, not because they disappear, but because they start showing up in places you can't explain away anymore. That's when escalation begins. The changes stopped being subtle. They were still quiet, but heavier now, like the air before a storm. Conversations felt strained, as if we were both choosing our words too carefully, afraid that the wrong sentence might open something neither of us knew how to close again. They smiled less. They listened differently. They were present, but distant, like someone standing behind glass. I started to worry. Not abstract worry. Real, physical worry. The kind that sits in your chest and tightens when you think about saying the wrong thing. So I did what people do when worry threatens their sense of control. I minimized it. This bear just going through something. This'll tell me when they sipped you ready. I don't want to push. These aren't sipped excuses. They're permissions. Permissions to stay passive while something actively deteriorates. In history, this is the phase where leaders hold meetings, where reports are softened, where words like temporary, manageable, and under control get repeated until they feel true. Not because they are, but because believing them is easier than acting. I became my own authority figure, and I justified inaction beautifully. When my friend withdrew further, I called it space. When they stopped reaching out, I told myself I shouldn't intrude. When days turned into weeks, I assumed silence was a choice, not a warning. I respected their boundaries so completely that I ignored the possibility they were building walls out of desperation, not preference. There's a dangerous myth we tell ourselves about independence, that needing help is weakness and respecting distance is always kindness. But sometimes distance is not strength. Sometimes it's surrender. I remember a conversation where everything was right there, close enough to touch. They said quietly, "I'm just tired of everything." Not dramatic, not emotional, just tired. That should have stopped me cold. Instead, I nodded. I told them everyone feels that way sometimes. That sentence still echoes in my head. Everyone feels that way sometimes. It sounded compassionate. It sounded grounding. It was a dismissal dressed as empathy. Escalation doesn't arrive as chaos. It arrives as repetition. The same statements, the same reassurances, the same avoidance, over and over, until it becomes a pattern too familiar to challenge. I thought I was being patient. I thought I was being understanding. I thought I was being a good friend. But patience without presence is just distance over time. Inside, I felt the tension growing, the sense that something important was slipping beyond my reach. I considered calling them late one night, considered showing up unannounced, considered saying the thing that felt too heavy to carry alone. Then I imagined how awkward it might be, how uncomfortable, how wrong I might be. And fear made the decision for me. Fear of overreacting, fear of misreading the situation, fear of facing something I couldn't fix. So I waited. Waiting feels harmless, responsible even. But in moments like this, waiting is an action, and it has consequences. By the time I realized the situation was serious, truly serious, the weight of all those justifications came crashing down at once. I wasn't stayed calm anymore. I was late. There was a realization that settled over me, heavy and unavoidable. Whatever was happening to my best friend, it was no longer small, and neither was my role in ignoring it. The truth was finally impossible to avoid. But by then the cost of denial had already been paid. There was, as always, a moment history circles in red. A narrow window where everything could still change. Where the outcome isn't fixed yet, just leaning in a dangerous direction. You don't recognize it when you stay inside it. For me, that moment arrived quietly. No announcement, no countdown. Just a feeling that time was running differently now. Faster, sharper, less forgiving. I remember staring at my phone, rereading a message that felt final without actually saying goodbye. Sorry I've been distant. Just dealing with stuff. That was it. No explanation. No request. No opening. And yet, it was an opening. I could have gone to them. Could have called and refused to hang up. Could have said, "I'm not asking politely anymore." I felt it. That internal pressure. That instinct we learn to ignore, because it disrupts our plans. This is important. This is now. Instead I hesitated. I told myself I didn't want to overwhelm them, that giving space was the right thing, that they'd reach out when they were ready. That lie was gentle. It was also fatal. Point of no return moments don't feel dramatic. They feel inconvenient. They ask you to rearrange your life, your priorities, your self-image. They demand courage without guarantees. And I blinked. There was another chance. A smaller one. A message left unread, longer than usual. A call that went to voicemail. I noticed. I felt the shift. I still didn't act, because by then, part of me already believed it might be too late, and that belief became an excuse to do nothing. Regret is born here, not in catastrophe, but in hesitation, in the space between knowing and doing. When I finally decided to intervene, to show up, to insist, to break the silence, the world had already moved on without my permission. I learned about it the way people always do, indirectly, unexpectedly, too late to matter. The words didn't feel real at first. They hovered in the air, disconnected from meaning, like hearing a foreign language you almost understand. My mind searched for alternatives, misunderstandings, errors. There had to be one more window. There wasn't state. Everything I thought was permanent had been provisional. Everything I thought was stable had been fragile. And the moment I thought I could have tomorrow had expired. People talk about closure, about final conversations, about last chances to say what matters. Those are luxuries. Most endings don't offer them. The point of no return doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It waits for you to notice it. After it's gone, I carry that moment with me now. Not as a memory, but as a weight, a constant reminder that the most important decisions are often the ones we delay until decision is no longer possible. And once that line is crossed, there is no crossing back. After the moment passes, time does something strange. It doesn't speed up. It doesn't slow down. It empties. The days after felt hollow, like walking through a house after the furniture has been removed. The walls are still there. The light still comes in, but nothing absorbs the sound anymore. Every thought echoes. I kept expecting the world to react, to pause, to acknowledge what had happened. It didn't. People went to work. Traffic moved. Messages came in about things that suddenly felt offensive in their normality. I answered some of them, ignored others. I don't remember deciding which was which. Grief didn't just arrive as tears. It arrived as confusion. I would forget, just for a second, and then remember again, over and over. Each time the realization landed like it was new. They were gone. There was no dramatic collapse, no public unraveling, just a slow internal shutdown. My mind replayed old conversations on a loop, searching for hidden meanings, for missed signals, for a sentence that, if interpreted differently, might have changed the ending. There was that one. That's the cruelest part. When something ends quietly, there's no single cause to blame, no villain, no clear failure, just a series of small, reasonable decisions that collectively led here. That makes it harder to survive. I moved through rooms filled with their absence. Jokes that no longer had a recipient. Memories that suddenly felt one-sided. I realized how many parts of my life were built around the assumption they would always be there to witness it. Now, no one was. Fear crept in next. Not fear of death, but fear of silence. Of all the things I would never know. All the thoughts they took with them. All the pain they carried alone because I mistook quiet for strength. The collapse wasn't explosive. It was a long, dull ache, a constant awareness that something essential had been removed from the structure of my life, and the rest of it was now shifting to compensate. I began to understand something unsettling. The consequences weren't just that my friend was gone. The consequences were what their absence revealed. How fragile connection really is. How easy it is to miss the moment that matters. How permanent the results of temporary decisions can be. At night, the questions came. What if I had acted sooner? What if I had ignored politeness? What if I had chosen discomfort over distance? There are no answers to those questions, only echoes. And in that emotional emptiness where grief finally settled into something colder, I realized the story wasn't over. Because what happens after loss is often more dangerous than the loss itself. After the collapse, there's a strange pressure to move on. Not from others, from yourself. The world expects adaptation, recovery, a return to baseline. It rewards functionality, not honesty. So you learn how to carry the weight quietly, like everyone else. I went back to living. At least, that tests what it looked like. But something had changed in how I moved through the world. Every interaction felt thinner. Every laugh felt borrowed. I started listening differently, not to what people said, but to what they avoided. Because absence teaches you a new language. Grief didn't stop with time. It sharpened. It turned into awareness. I began to see how often we mistake survival for wellness. How often we congratulate people for holding it together instead of asking why they have to. How frequently we accept "I'm fine" as a complete answer because pressing further would force us to carry part of the weight. I saw myself everywhere. In friends who changed the subject too quickly. In long pauses filled with jokes. In eyes that asked for help without ever forming the words. And every time, a quiet panic followed. What if I miss it again? The realization came slowly, but it landed hard. Losing my best friend didn't just take them from my life. It exposed how close we all live to irreversible moments. How often the line between still time and too late is thinner than we think. I had believed that love was enough, that history protected us, that care didn't need to be expressed urgently, because it was understood. I was wrong. Love unspoken is invisible. Concern delayed is indistinguishable from indifference. And silence, no matter how well-intentioned, can be lethal. The aftermath isn't stat about pain anymore. It's about responsibility. About realizing that awareness is no longer optional. That once you've seen what avoidance costs, you don't get to unknow it. You carry that knowledge forward, whether you want to or not. I became more attentive, more intrusive, more willing to be uncomfortable. Not because it felt good, but because comfort had already taken enough from me. Still, there sits a shadow that follows me. The understanding that insight arrived too late to save the one person who taught it to me. That is a weight you never set down. In the quiet moments when the world finally slows, I think about how many people are standing where I once stood, trusting routine, respecting distance, waiting for clearer signs, believing they are being patient. I know now what patience can cost. And that knowledge brings me to the last thing my friend gave me without ever meaning to. A warning. One I didn't hear in time, but one that stays silent about now. If you sister are listening to this, you still have time. That is just not comfort. It's responsibility. Because the most dangerous lie we tell ourselves is that urgency requires certainty, that we need proof before we act, that we'll know when a moment is critical. You once state, "Nothing about my friend's last days looked like an emergency. That's why it worked. That's why it won." The signs were subtle, polite, easy to excuse. They always are. If someone in your life feels distant, don't label it independence. If their energy feels dimmer, don't call it maturity. If something in you whispers that this matters, don't silence it. That voice exists for a reason. Ask again. Stay longer. Make the call that feels awkward. Sit in the silence without rescuing it. Discomfort is temporary. Regret is not. Don't wait for permission to care loudly. Don't assume love is obvious. Don't trust time to protect what attention neglects. Because the moment you think you'll handle it later is already slipping away. I believed there would always be another conversation, another chance to be serious, another day to say the things that felt too heavy for the moment. There wasn't stat. This isn't about death. It's about delay, about all the ways we postpone the essential, because it interrupts the ordinary, about how we mistake survival for safety and call it wisdom. If someone came to mind while you were listening to this, that sip's not coincidence. That sip's the warning I missed. Don't just honor the story by remembering it. Honor it by interrupting your own comfort. Make the call. Ask the question. Stay. Because the most terrifying thing about loss is that it happens. It's that most of the time, it happens while we are still telling ourselves, there's just plenty of time left.